So the EU have been proactive so far in showing solidarity with the Belarusian people, with the civil society, and also supporting Belarusian democratic actors, inviting them to the policy discussions and taking into account their opinion on how the crisis could be resolved. And particularly, it is important that European leaders several times raised the issue of possibility of facilitating OSCE mediation for Belarus, and it is important that such steps were conducted in consultations with the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and at the approval of the democratic society. The EU launched such conversations with Vladimir Putin, knowing that Russia is, of course, an important actor in the region. And also the EU has introduced sanctions and cut political ties, which is important. But then the open question is how much the sanctions, what is the actual content of those sanctions? Because it's easier to put on the lists those judges or police officers and to ban their entrance to the EU or to freeze their accounts, but it is much more painful to show solidarity in sanctions when it comes to the interests of the enterprises, when it comes to trade that targets or that would affect EU companies dealing with Belarus. But at the same time, sanctions are important to the extent that they put pressure on the Lukashenko cronies and on the elites to make them reconsider supporting Lukashenko and supporting the status quo. But at the same time, EU indeed has been quite proactive in the sense that several EU members have launched the universal jurisdiction principle to prosecute crimes committed by police officers in Belarus following the recommendations of OSCE Moscow mechanism. So at the EU Parliament there are several important discussions taking place on Belarus, calling for more decisive actions, for more pressure on the regime. And I would express special thanks to MPs who raised this issue instantly, even though right now Belarus is not so much on top of the agenda and not so much in the international focus. So the whole history of bilateral relations between EU and Belarus is an eternal cycle of distancing and rapprochement. After every time there is a crackdown on the opposition, the EU would distance itself, scale up the assistance to civil society and cut political contact, and then sort of make the steps towards Lukashenko when he makes promises to liberalize. But it is crucial to understand that this current situation is very different from all the previous cycles of crisis in Belarus. The mobilization of the society is unprecedented, and Belarusians have never fought that desperately and decisively for their freedom, and also at the cost of literally their lives and at the cost of enormous repressions which are happening every day. And in this context, it is important that EU does not fall into the trap of false promises of Lukashenko if he makes some in the future, trying to orchestrate constitutional reform or a national dialogue, which would never happen with the inclusion of actual democratic forces. So it is important for EU to push for a national dialogue, to push the Lukashenko to include democratic forces into actual national dialogue, and also to communicate to Russia to amplify the voices of the Belarusian democratic movement to Russia, knowing that, of course, Russia has a lot to say into resolution of this crisis, knowing that without Russian support, Lukashenko would not last long. And one of the arguments communicated to Putin could be that, of course, we understand that Russia tends to support Lukashenko by inertia, and then just to sustain this autocratic leader who is very predictable and who is very dependent on Moscow. And it seems that at the moment Russia wants to sustain Lukashenko and then to conduct constitutional reform and then to maybe introduce pro-Russian political parties in Belarus, and essentially to resolve the crisis on its own terms, excluding the West and excluding the actual democratic opposition in Belarus. And so one of the arguments that EU could amplify in talks with Putin could be that the Belarusians would not accept any non-democratic leader, anyone from nomenclatura they would try to replace Lukashenko with, or not some candidate who is clearly pro-Russian and who is promoted by Moscow, because this time the struggle for Belarusian democracy is it is irreversible, and the Belarusian society has crossed the point of no return. And so the only lasting solution to the Belarusian crisis would be to have a democratic leader who has the actual support and legitimacy in the eyes of the society. So there are contrasting views among the most active part of the Belarusian society. One, there is an aspiration that the EU would somehow put international pressure on Lukashenko, and this is happening thanks to the activity of the Belarusian Democratic Forces, including Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. And there is this sort of abstract aspiration that somehow the EU would help us to keep Belarus in the spotlight and possibly facilitate the negotiations. And at the same time, there is this sense or fear that Belarusians are all alone in this crisis, knowing that, let's say, Western leaders or international institutions, they won't interfere, they won't trigger any substantial mechanism of, let's say, protecting human rights in Belarus, and the fear of Russia, knowing that security issues with Russia could be more of priority than Belarus, and that this situation could go back to this familiar pattern of sort of ignoring the crisis and just sustaining the status quo with only rhetorical condemnation of current violation of human rights in Belarus. So to talk about coordination of sanctions, I think it would be good to have an actual insights in talks with policymakers. Of course, on the based on publicly available information, if we look at the announcements of Biden administration, they would say yes, of course we are coordinating the sanctions with EU towards Belarus. But then it would be good to look into actual content of those sanctions. And again, important how much the sanctions would actually target most sensitive cronies of Lukashenko or some transactions, or let's say how much it would put an actual pressure rather than condemnation. And when we talk about the US sanctions, the Belarus Democracy Act also has this possibility to target Russian individuals who were complicit in suppressing the Belarusian protest. And then again, it's an open question: would the US have enough political will to go essentially at conflict with Russia over Belarus in this context, or there's always a threat or a risk that the lobbyists would do their job at the request of those cronies and make it sure that the sanctions won't be really targeting those individuals. And I'm saying this because this happened in the previous years, even in the years of normalization between Belarus and the West. And there was some sort of a scandal with the content of third package of sanctions in the EU when some companies were crossed out of the list last minute. So in the years of normalization between the US and Belarus, there were instances when lobbyists tried to advocate that Belarus should be excluded from the sanctions list, and that again Lukashenko is not so much of a bad guy, and that he could be dealt with the restoration of economic ties. So it's important not to allow this happen again. So there are two types of sanctions. One list targets the asset freeze and travel bans for certain individuals, such as judges and police officers and state officials who are complicit in the suppression of the protest and violent means. And also the other list targets companies that are considered to be related to the regime, and those are both private companies and some public enterprises were put on the list. But then again, it is a good question how much of those companies, let's say included in the third package of sanctions, how much they actually targeted the actual pockets of Lukashenko elites. And again, there was this there was a lot of discussion in the Belarusian media how certain Belarusian entrepreneurs who are closely related to Lukashenko, they managed to escape inclusion into these lists, and they also decided to move their assets out. So it's important to, again, keep the sanctions list as confidential as possible and not to leak the information, because the other part, like the Belarusian side, is very active and of course doing their best to be excluded from the sanctions. I would say that so far it won't be sufficient, judging by the actions of the EU and the policies towards Belarus. It wouldn't be sufficient to call EU as a geopolitical actor who has, let's say, enough leverage or weight in the region to sort of to be proactive and to be more proactive in solving the Belarusian crisis. And by this I mean that if we look at Belarusian crisis, clearly we see the sort of elephant in the room. We see Russia, who has much more say and interest and involvement into Belarusian crisis. And so far, the EU has limited its engagement to sanctions, rhetorical condemnation, or maybe hosting or participated in some talks at the international institutions, be it OSCE or UN bodies, presenting a joint position on Belarus, but not necessarily actively engaging with Russia or seeking some consistent strategy on how to make those OSCE talks happen, or how to convince Russia to make a few steps away and to allow Belarusian democratic protest unravel without intervention from Russia. So I would expect that more EU proactive role is needed. So I would say that EU has the capacity to amplify the voices of the Belarusian democratic opposition and to keep Belarus in the spotlight, in the sense that EU has much more institutional capacities and, again, political weight to keep Belarus in the spotlight. Also, for instance, when Belarusian opposition is trying to talk to Kremlin, they are excluded and shut down from this conversation because policy makers in Moscow do not take them seriously. when they try to communicate their position and to explain that the protest is not geopolitical, and then they just ask to withdraw support from Lukashenko, and sort of making a statement that we are open for a dialogue. Let's talk about how the future of Russia-Belarus relations could look like when Lukashenko resigns. And so in that sense, that would be important if EU leaders continue to talk to, let's say, Russia, and also continue to seek ways how to facilitate this mediation, or facilitate how to launch a national dialogue with international mediation and possibly conduct new elections. Without this, only the street protest on the ground won't be enough to make a change in the country, because Lukashenko heavily relies on the repressive apparatus, and people are paying enormous price for their lives and freedoms every day. But without international pressure, this crisis won't likely resolve.